Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
Our conversation this time around is called The Master Servant, which sounds like a combination of opposites. So, Mike, briefly, what are we going to be hearing about today?
We're going to look at an incredible story today when Jesus, the Son of God, the master of everything, becomes a servant by taking up the lowly place and washing the feet of his disciples at that Passover meal the night before he was betrayed and crucified.
I was going to say, at what point in time is this happening? So that's at a key moment in his final days.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we're now within the last hours of his human life here. And so John, in fact, and we'll look at the account in John's Gospel, chapter 13. In fact, John devotes half of his Gospel to the last week of Jesus' life. That's incredible. Half the Gospel's been taken up with his whole life. Now the second half, solely focusing on these events of the last hours of Jesus' life and then his crucifixion and burial and resurrection. So clearly for John, who was there for this event, of course, these last hours were incredibly important to him.
When you think about biographies, if somebody spent half of the biography just writing about the last week in the life of that individual, that would be unusual.
It would be very unusual, wouldn't it? I mean, biographies these days are very common. And they often go back to their childhood at great length and then how they started to develop an interest in a certain thing in their first opening and how things develop. And they're often pretty thick tomes as well these days, aren't they? But yeah, for someone today to have devoted half their book to just the last week of someone's life would be, well, really quite exceptional. I don't think I've ever read that sort of biography or autobiography. So this is unusual. This stands out. This is John saying to us, this is the most important part of the story. I've told you in my prologue how the Word, the eternal Word, Jesus, the Son of God, came into this world. I've chosen for you 7 of the signs that he performed and 7 of his great sayings, and I've given you 7 witnesses, 7 all the way through, 7 God's number, the perfect number. But now in the second half of my book, I want to focus on what all this was preparing for and leading up to.
So in a sense, the camera's zooming in on the last hours of Jesus' life. So there's a lot of detail, no doubt, and lots of surprises.
Yes, though, as this section of the book begins, it starts with anything but a surprise as far as Jesus is concerned. John 13 opens with these words. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. That's interesting, isn't it? Jesus knew that the time had come. The Greek literally there says, and some English translations have this, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world. And there's this strong sense in the Gospel of John of the hour, the moment, the right moment, we might say. John uses it on 7 separate occasions. And it's as if he and Jesus are underlining what is about to happen might look as though the world has gone mad, as though sin is triumphing, as though the baddies win. But I want you to know, no, behind all this, through all of this, God is steadily working out his plan. He is still on the throne, a theme that's pretty consistent throughout the whole of Scripture. He's there working all things together for good, and even that which people try to use against him and his purposes, he just takes and weaves into this wonderful plan that he has. So, yeah, the big surprise here is that all that is about to follow is not a surprise for Jesus. He's just steadily moving in rhythm with his Father's heartbeat, knowing the hour has come.
So everything that's sort of gone before, leading up to this moment, and in a sense, this is it.
This is it. And I love the phrase that follows that in chapter 13, because it says that having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. Or some translations say how very much he loved them. He loved them to the end, another translation says. So as you said, this is it. This is what it's all been leading up to. He has indeed loved people. But now John's saying, this is it. This is where he's really going to show how much he loved them. This is what it's all been leading up to, these final hours.
So the timing is perfect, and it's happening at a particular moment in the year.
Yeah, I mean, an incredible sense of timing here. Jesus is going to die at the time of the Jewish Passover festival. Now, let's just do a little bit of backstory on that for any listeners who are not familiar with it. Passover was one of the most important Jewish festivals. There were three: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, when every Jewish man had to go to Jerusalem, to the temple. So that in itself shows you how important they were. But Passover really stood out because it looked back to Israel's history, to the time when God's people had ended up in slavery in Egypt and were being cruelly treated by Pharaoh, who'd subjected them to slavery as immigrants in his nation. He'd become fearful of this growing group of immigrants, had made them slaves, and God's people had called out to him. And he'd responded by sending Moses to rescue them. And there were a whole series of plagues, 10 plagues, the last of which was the death of the firstborn in the land of Egypt. But the Israelites were spared. God told them to daub a lamb's blood over their doorposts. And that night, when the angel of death passed through the land, wherever he saw that blood, he would spare that family. So the Israelite firstborn had been spared while the Egyptian firstborn were killed. Pharaoh, remember, had killed many of the Israelite firstborn himself, having had them thrown into the River Nile to be eaten by crocodiles. And as part of that, God had instituted this festival of Passover, when they would eat unleavened bread, when they would eat some of that roasted lamb that had been sacrificed so the blood could be put over the door. And God had said on that day, you're to celebrate this festival every year. Why? Because I don't want you to forget. Never forget what God has done for you. By the way, still a good thing to remember today in passing. Never forget what you came from. Never forget where you were when God found you. Never forget what he's done for you, how he's rescued you. And so Passover was this great celebration of how God had rescued them. But it was also, by New Testament times, becoming a meal of anticipation, looking forward to how God would one day rescue them again. First and foremost from these latest invaders of their land, the Romans, under whose power they now were. So Passover both looked to the past of how God had rescued them, anticipated the future, that God would yet come again one day through his Messiah and overthrow his enemies and establish his kingdom on earth, and Jerusalem would be the center of everything. So it was an incredibly important festival. And it's that festival that Jesus is going to reinterpret, which we'll look at in a future episode. But it's that festival here for which they are gathering in John chapter 13.
So even though he knew the hour had come, even though he knew he was going to die very soon, he still went through with the tradition of the Passover meal.
Yes, because it was going to be so important, because, of course, what he was about to do would be exactly what that meal spoke of. His death on the cross, which now was only hours away, would be both the means of God rescuing people from slavery. Slavery to what? Slavery to their sin. And would be the means of him bringing in God's future kingdom one day. So it's It's not an accident. This is the amazing timing of God, that all his enemies are lining up their ducks, as it were, to be able to get him at last. On this very moment, this powerful symbolic moment, this is rescue moment, this is deliverance moment that Jesus will take, reinterpret, and now focus not on an event in history, but in what he is about to do.
Well, let's talk about the meal perhaps next time and focus now on what happens just prior to the meal itself.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, why don't I just read a few verses here and then we'll talk about it together, because here comes the first surprise in what Jesus does. I'll just read it and maybe listeners can just look out for the surprise themselves. The evening meal was being served. So they've just started the process of serving the different courses of this Passover meal. And the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Oh, wow, what a contrast here between God's deliverance and Judas's treachery. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel round his waist, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him.
Who would normally do that?
Well, it would normally have been done by a servant. Remember, these were days when people were walking on dusty roads. So, you could have had a bath and you could have made yourself all nice and ready for the party or the meal you were going to. But having walked along those dusty roads, by the time you arrived at your host's house, your feet really would be dusty. And since they often ate reclining, that is, leaning on their left elbow stretched out with sort of feet slanted away from the low table or the rug in front of them, there could be a danger that your feet would be very close to someone else's face, and that's not what you'd want. So normally you'd have a servant, especially for something special like this, there to wash everyone's feet. And clearly there'd been a hiccup. Clearly there was no servant for that day. Maybe it was because it had been arranged fairly last minute. Maybe the caterers had just not provided what they needed to. Who knows? But for some reason, there was no servant to do this really fundamental task of washing people's feet so there's no dusty, smelly feet around while you're enjoying your nice meal.
So whereas perhaps we might wash our hands, perhaps sometimes a bit too quickly, before a meal, this was very much part of getting ready for the meal, washing the feet.
Yes, absolutely, and would have been a very routine thing in that sort of country with its dusty roads and hot climate.
So the disciples gathered around ready for this meal with Jesus would have presumably expected a servant to turn up, to appear and to participate.
Yeah, absolutely, but it's clear, it's not going to happen. By the way, notice the incredible amount of eyewitness detail in this story as we go on. John tells us the evening meal was being served. It started. This is like, you've sat down for the meal and you've not washed your hands yet, or you've not washed your feet yet. Hello. And again, put yourself in the story. What might you be doing at this point? I think perhaps you'd be, looking around and thinking, hang on. In fact, let me give you an illustration. It would be as if we had gone to a wedding and all the guests that sat down, you know what happens? We go ahead and we all sit at the tables, don't we? And then we wait for the MC to announce, ladies and gentlemen, the new Mr. and Mrs. Taverner. And, everybody stands up, don't they, and applaud, and the bride and groom walk in. And only then does top table start to get served its food, and then all the rest of us. But imagine what it would be like, if there you were sitting around waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Taverner to walk in, but, the waiters are already there and the soup or the prawn salad is already being put down in front of you and people are, ready to eat and you've not still come in. It's a bit like that. This is crazy. Hang on. You shouldn't be serving the meal yet. We've not welcomed the new couple. Shouldn't be serving the meal yet. We've not had our feet washed. How can we go on and have the meal without that? And I love to put my imagination into Bible stories. I imagine the disciples start, looking at one another and thinking, what's going to happen? Maybe mouthing to one another, what's happened? And then maybe, knowing what human nature is, them starting to think, well, I think Philip should do this. I'm sure I did this last time. And I don't think Philip's ever done it, actually. Philip, why don't you get up and do it? And these all sorts of thoughts going through their mind, no doubt, at that point.
And it's Jesus who steps forward and washes the feet.
It's Jesus, the master servant, as we've called him. Master servant because there's no servant like him. But master servant because he's the master who became the servant. And I love what John tells us about why he could do this. I just want to read one verse again. Verse 3 says that Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he'd come from God and was returning to God. So he got up and washed their feet. Now just notice those things. There's a number of things. First of all, Jesus was secure in his identity. He knew he'd come from God. He knew who he was. He knew he was the Son of God. He knew that his Father, not just God, but God, his Father, had put all things under his power. He is secure in his identity, in who he is. Secondly, he's secure in his destiny. He knew that he'd come from God, but he knew that he was returning to God. He knew where he was headed in life. And when you are secure in your identity and your destiny, you can do anything. Nothing is above you and nothing is beneath you. And it was because he was secure in his identity and his destiny that he can get up and say, I'll wash the feet. It's not beneath me. It doesn't make me any less by taking off my robe, wrapping the towel around me, washing and drying feet. I find that to be so powerful when we're secure in our identity, who we are, and when we're secure in our destiny, knowing where we're going. Wow, life changes. It's a bit like one of the things I love, and actually I know you love as well, are these TV programs where people try and find their history, their ancestry, who do you think you are, and programs like that. And where there's something sort of missing, there's a hole because, perhaps they were given away when they were a baby and, there's something missing in their life. And then suddenly through the researchers' help, they find who their mother is or who their grandparents were or whatever it might be. And suddenly things change because they've got an identity. Now, they had an identity before, but there was a hole in it. There was something missing. But the change you see in the hugs they give to the missing loved one, or the wow when they discover that they go right back to be an ancestor of Henry VIII or whatever it might be, those sort of programs show how important identity and destiny still are for us today.
So I've got to ask you, because this is a very important question. How can we find out our security in our identity and in our destiny?
Well, at a human level, who am I? I'm Mike Beaumont, the son of Eric and Jean, and my grandparents and so on. And so I could answer at that level, but I know you're asking for more than that. Who am I? I'm a son of the living God. Why? Because when I was 18 years old, some people took the time to tell me the good news of Jesus. They shared the gospel with me, and over a period between leaving sixth form and going to university, over that summer, I increasingly heard this message and it made sense. And I came to the point where I got down on my knees by my bed and said, Jesus, I want to give my life to you and invite you to come and be my Lord. And I commit myself to living for you from this point on. And at that point, I was what the Bible calls, what John calls earlier in his gospel, I was born again. My life started again. My past life, with all its mess and sin that I'd acquired even in 18 years, was washed clean. And I was given a brand new start. And at that very moment, I became a son of the living God. God, I can honestly say, is my Father. Jesus is my brother and my friend. And many years have passed since I made that decision at the age of 18. But I know who I am. I know my identity. And that's given me security. Many times when people have said things about me or thrown things at me, yes, sometimes they've hurt. That's the honest truth. But I've gone back again and again and said, but who am I? I am a son of the living God, and I have God's favor and God's approval, even if I don't have yours. One of the consequences of making that decision is I now know my destiny. My destiny is that on the day that I breathe my last breath on this earth, I will breathe my first breath in God's heaven. I will be with him forever. John again is very strong on this theme of if we put our trust in him, we will experience eternal life. Now, that just doesn't mean life like I know it now going on forever. Frankly, for some people, that wouldn't be heaven, that would be hell. Eternal life is life of God's eternity, life of his dimension, which breaks into my life now and which will never end. So I can honestly say that I know my identity and I know my destiny. And that gives me security. And I can honestly say I'll give myself to whatever is needed of me. And I'll follow the example of Jesus, my servant here. And if that includes washing feet, and I've done certainly the equivalent of that over the years, then I'm very happy to do it. Because like Jesus, I know my identity and my destiny.
And I guess Jesus, in the context of this meal, wanted those disciples around him to understand their identity and their destiny as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And he wants them to follow him. Now, of course, the minute that he starts to do this, all the disciples suddenly get like, oh, no, you can't do it, Lord, I need to do it. And actually, Peter says to him, Lord, you're going to wash my feet? And Jesus says, you don't realize what I'm doing now, but you will. And then Peter says, no, Lord, you shall never wash my feet. Suddenly it's like, oh no, this is beneath you, Lord. But 2 minutes ago, he wouldn't have done it himself. And Jesus replies, Peter, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Now, he's not thinking there of washing the feet. He's thinking symbolically here. He needed to wash with the blood that he would shed on the cross for them within hours of this event happening now. And so here he is, he's modeling something for them. He is saying, not only is what I'm doing a prophetic picture of what's about to happen for you, it's actually a lifestyle I'm modeling for you. He'll actually go on to say, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. And I don't think he was thinking literally there. Though, actually, there are still some Christian denominations today who will have an annual foot washing ceremony, particularly on the evening before Good Friday, to remember this event. I think Jesus is speaking metaphorically here. What I am looking for from you as my followers is that you learn how to serve, you learn how to get low, you learn how to give yourselves for others in the same way that I am giving myself as, well, what Isaiah called the suffering servant. Isaiah prophesied over 700 years before Jesus that when God's Messiah would come, he would come as God's servant who would suffer in our place. And Jesus has picked that theme up several times during the past 3 years of his ministry. There's one example in Mark chapter 10 where actually James and John come and do the very opposite of this story. They come to Jesus and say, Jesus, we've got a favor to ask you. And he says, yeah, what's that? And they said to us, let one of us sit at your right and the other sit at your left when you come in your glory. Can we have the best seats in the house when the kingdom comes? And of course, all the other disciples are pretty annoyed when they hear about this. But Jesus takes this as an opportunity to say to them, you don't really know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And they sort of say, oh, yes, because they don't understand what he's referring to there, of course, the cross. And Jesus will take this as an opportunity, as the other disciples are so angry about their, trying to muscle in and get the best seats. And he says this to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all, for even the Son of Man himself did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And here was a prophetic parable, an acting out of the extent to which that serving was about to happen. Jesus, the master servant.
But the example there with James and John illustrates that actually being a servant doesn't come naturally to us, really.
No, I don't think it does. Now, there are some people who it does seem to come more easily to than others. But, I think innate to all of us is to look after number one first, to put us and our needs first, and then our families around us. And, while there's a healthy way in which we should care for ourselves and our family, obviously there is something innate in all of us whereby servant-heartedness is not instinctive. You're good at my expense is a motto that I was taught early on in my Christian life by a godly old saint of God, and is one that I've tried to live by, and certainly I've tried to train all my leaders and people I've been responsible for to adopt. What does servanthood mean? It means you're good at my expense. It's going to cost me. It cost Jesus something at one level to do this, and yet at another level, it didn't cost him anything. But you're good at my expense is a good motto for us to follow. And these disciples were struggling with that. They'd not become perfect overnight when they started following Jesus. They did have issues they still had to sort out. And that sort of question with which those two came to Jesus and wanted the best seats in the house, then the annoyance of the others when they heard about it. Why? Because they wanted the best seats in the house. And Jesus is saying here, the best seat in the house is actually the seat of the servant, the seat of the one who can get low, the seat of the one for whom nothing is beneath him or her. And you can serve because you're absolutely secure in who you are. You know where you've come from. You know where you're going. And when you're secure in that, like Jesus was, then you can do anything and nothing is beneath you.
How should this work out practically, in our families, in our workplace, in our church?
Well, I think, take that motto, you're good at my expense. Look for opportunities where you can serve others, where you can put yourself out to others. Now, not every single example of serving will put us out, but there ought to be times when it does put us out, when it's not convenient, when a request goes round on our social media app from our small group at church where it says, could anyone help with this? Because, maybe it's not convenient, but why not sometimes put yourself out and say, well, yeah, doesn't quite fit. I'll change what I was doing. I'll come and do that for you. I'll pick your kids up. I'll make a meal on that occasion. So look to make your serving really practical. The last thing it should be is just a service once a year when we ceremonially, symbolically wash one another's feet. This should be a lifestyle so secure in our identity and our destiny that nothing is beneath us. Doesn't matter whether we're the CEO of the company or the person who cleans the offices at the end of the day. This applies to all who are followers of Jesus. Nothing should be beneath us. Look for little practical opportunities whereby you can help, you can bless someone, you can serve them in a way that, might cost you. You're good at my expense. In fact, there's my challenge to listeners this week. Why not go out and look for how you could make that motto yours to live by this week? You're good at my expense. And if you live that out, then you'll definitely be following the example of the master servant.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.